So welcome back to the Better Dwelling YouTube channel. I am joined here by James Cohen, and today we are going to be talking about beneficial ownership and money laundering in Canada and Canadian real estate. It's a topic that probably doesn't get as much attention as it should, and I think we're going to discuss maybe why that is. But before we start, if you could maybe just introduce yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me today. My name is James Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Canada. We're the Canadian chapter of Transparency International, the world's largest anti-corruption movement.
Amazing. And so I guess most of the research that you're doing or the topics that you're interested are around sort of the impact of things that are outside of that scope of transparency. And in Canada, a lot of that is capital that maybe shouldn't be touching real estate is doing so. And it's doing so in a meaningful way based on what some of the information that's coming out is. So what's a necessary way to either shed light on that, create transparency, or to solve that problem? We hear a lot about beneficial ownership and a beneficial ownership registry. What exactly is beneficial ownership, and why should the average Canadian who interacts with real estate or, is part of the Canadian economy, why should they care about it?
Yeah, so beneficial ownership really just means who is the true or ultimate beneficial owner is really just who is the true living owner of something. So say you have company ABC is owned by company EDF, got that wrong, is owned by company 123, is owned by Bob. Who's Bob? Not, each one of those companies, but who's that Bob person at the end of the day? That's your ultimate beneficial owner. And the reason why Canada should care is because a lot of people around the world have noticed that we're not too good at figuring out who Bob is. And for one, the Financial Action Task Force, who oversees global anti-money laundering standards, has scolded Canada. Transparency International, my organization, has scolded Canada for our inability to find this out. And most importantly, the enablers, the companies' formation agents, lawyers, and accountants who want to help people with illicit money know that Canada has weak beneficial ownership transparency and actively market Canada as a secrecy jurisdiction because of this fact.
It's wild to hear that. But, I think based on what you're seeing in capital, I mean, maybe not visible capital markets trends, but capital markets trends that I would say most individuals in the real estate industry are relatively aware of, right? It's almost unignorable that this factor exists. I guess maybe, the first thing to discuss there is, what does a beneficial ownership framework look like? Like, what does that registry look like? And I actually was recently at an event where Tim Hudak from the Ontario Real Estate Association spoke and said, we need that, and we need a searchable beneficial ownership registry sooner rather than later. And I think it's interesting when you're hearing about the sort of the policy environment, especially in Canada, where we've got all of these non-resident speculation taxes happening. And now we're hearing a foreign ownership ban coming into place at a federal level in January of next year. They're like throwing all of these policy solutions, let's call them, at this problem, but we haven't even correctly identified maybe what the problem is yet, because we don't know who these owners are, right? So what would a beneficial ownership registry look like, and how close are we to the development of that at a provincial level or a federal level in Canada?
Right. So when we say that we're really bad at figuring out who the beneficial owners are in Canada, it's an idea of, well, how do you even find the information to find them out? So in 2017, the federal government and the provinces agreed that, well, we'll amend our corporate laws to require companies to have beneficial ownership information on hand. So that way, if law enforcement or competent authorities want to figure something out because something is fishy, they'll go search for it. But beyond that, the financial institutions are the one really, they're our gatekeepers in Canada up until recently, and then also designated non-financial businesses and professions. So our accountants, our lawyers, and our real estate agents now have to do beneficial ownership due diligence. The idea behind a registry is that, as opposed to like having those gatekeepers and the wall and the information come at them, bring all that beneficial ownership information into one place, a registry that the federal government is then liable for figuring out the validity of the data that's in there. So there's already countries that have done this. The UK made the world's first beneficial ownership registry that's publicly accessible. I can access it. You can access it. Anybody watching this can access it. And we're calling for Canada to make one. It's not a silver bullet to fighting all illicit financial flows that make their way into Canada, but it is a critical tool to either dissuade people from exploiting us for the gaps that all the crooks know we have, and for trying to fish out those people who think they can still game the system.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting because, if anything, it would increase the risk factor at a minimum for somebody to be partaking in something like that, where, even at its simplest form, something like money laundering is, a way to take cash and turn it into currency that's recognized by the financial system. And the easiest way that when we hear about this a lot in the industry is, a lot of purchasers paying their contractors in cash. Contractors love cash, and then they'll refinance or sell the asset and realize that capital appreciation that they built into the property through those renovations. But now all of a sudden, if that corporate entity because the corporate entity, if they have no exposure through a beneficial ownership registry, they just didn't know that somebody was bringing cash to that individual on the property to pay them. Now, all of a sudden, I think there's a degree of risk because there's liability associated with their tenure of the property. And I guess one of the other pieces that I find funny is in the current situation, realtors, real estate professionals like myself are the last line of defense against money laundering. They're the ones who are gathering FinTrack data or whatever it is. And so I think that, says a lot about the serious, like whether or not the powers that be are serious about that task in Canada right now, given that it's, the most saturated profession and one that's under scrutiny a lot for, we saw the fraud expose on CBC recently as well. Do you think that the lack of a beneficial ownership registry where we stand right now is contributing to Canada's money laundering problem? And if so, do you feel that that's contributing to an inflation in asset values as well?
Yeah, it's definitely a problem that we have, and it's definitely getting into the real estate market because real estate is, a favored asset of money launderers to park their money in because it can go up in value. They can enjoy it. Money launderers are taking money from some of the most impoverished places on earth, and then they want to go enjoy it in places like London or Paris or Toronto or Vancouver and get away from their fellow kleptocrats who could equally steal that money. So it does find its way, and as we discussed, it is actively marketed in a report that we put out with our coalition partners in what we call the End Snowwashing Coalition. Snowwashing is what we refer to as money laundering in Canada. We did a report earlier this year looking at how Canada's marketed, and we found websites in Russian and Mandarin and English that are advertising Canada coming like right up to the edge of saying, bring your illegal money to Canada. It's basically saying, hey, other countries are cracking down on beneficial ownership opaqueness. Canada is a prestige country that no one thinks of. No one really scrutinizes here. So it's all marketed. Now, as to the impact on real estate, it's always interesting to try and quantify that. And the Cohen Commission recently in British Columbia that happened over the last few years to look into money laundering in the province that was initiated initially from money laundering through casinos, but expanded to look at money laundering in real estate and luxury goods. They did try and do a calculation of the impact of money laundering, or really it was actually the BC Ministry of Finance who commissioned a report. And the report has critics, and there's people who question some of the calculations. So feel free, any of your followers, to read it. But they did calculate that on average, I think it is a 7% impact on housing prices on average across BC. That's across BC, not even the lower mainland where it's really an issue. So I would never, ever say that money laundering is the reason for housing inflation in Canada. I think we all know that. I think we've seen all the other reasons, but it's a kind of cherry on top, and a very poisonous cherry at that. Who wants to know that our property is inching up that incremental little bit because a human rights violator in another country, or someone who's ripping off all their impoverished citizens, is taking that money and dumping it into a condo that they barely ever live in to take away from the property market here, as a piggy bank in the sky for themselves for their dirty money. Who wants to know that their property value went up because of that?
Yeah, I mean it's certainly a big moral hazard associated with, and it makes you wonder. I don't know honestly, like if how the average Canadian would necessarily feel about it, and I think that for the most part, people tend to have that sort of ignorance is bliss mentality towards a lot of these issues that we deal with as a society. But then I think that when it rears its ugly head and you realize that the risk associated with that inflation, as you start to see property values recoil, and people whose primary incentive to get involved with real estate might have been an ulterior motive rather than housing creation, or even creating a real return. Maybe they're not even a rational consumer because they have an ulterior motive, which could be loss harvesting, which could be money laundering, which could be whatever it is. And, when you've got a market that's detached from fundamentals like Toronto's real estate market or Vancouver's real estate market, where people are happy to invest in condos, like you mentioned, and because even if they're losing money on a monthly basis, because it has those ulterior benefits that you don't necessarily hear about. Maybe you hear about them through your research being sold to people in other places, but we don't hear about that. We don't talk about that as much here. And
just on your point about people knowing, it's one of those kind of people do know. It's just until recently it was talked about. I think in Vancouver, and especially you heard about it for a couple of years in advance of people knowing that they were seeing empty condos just going around, and who's actually buying all of these. And that's not to say that everyone is a money launderer that owns one of these, or that owning a numbered corporation is illegal or implies that you're doing something illegal. Lots of people have numbered corporations for perfectly legitimate reasons, or buy property through them for legitimate reasons. But the percentage of them that we just can't figure out, it's a national security issue. It's a domestic security issue. It helps facilitate things like the fentanyl trade. And the average Canadian is like, there's that kind of, I know something fishy is going on. And it's only until around 2019 that the Prime Minister acknowledged this as a national kind of threat, and that we're seeing, at least at the federal level, the government starting to take steps that are necessary. We need to see the provinces really kick in the effort to help out. We saw that with BC and the Cullen Commission. We really need to see that in Ontario. And I'm thankful to Tim Hudak and the Ontario Housing Association for backing these efforts.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess on that note, like, what would be the most meaningful next steps to actually fixing this problem? Like, if you were the one who is advising on this policy, and perhaps you are, what are you telling people to do next? Like, how do we get to the perfect world to prevent this from happening?
So first of all, there is no perfect world. I wouldn't make that claim to anyone.
Fair enough.
The crooks are going to find what they want to do. The idea is to get in their way, close down the amounts of spaces they have, and give our law enforcement, even our citizens, the tools to figure them out. So again, a beneficial ownership registry, a publicly accessible one at the federal level, it's not a silver bullet, but it is an absolutely critical tool. But the provinces really need to work with the feds. So we've got the pledge for that registry coming up in 2023. But the federal corporate registry only accounts for about 10% of companies in the country. So you need Ontario, you need BC, you need everyone. Like, you can't have a holdout province like, say, New Brunswick. Otherwise, that's where the crooks will go, because they know it's the outlier. And all of a sudden, New Brunswick is Canada's Delaware or Nevada or Switzerland or Cayman Islands. So having the registry is there, and we're still waiting for Innovation Science Economic Development Canada to come out with the proposed specs of the registry. So it's Ministry of Finance who has the mandate to review money laundering, but I said Innovation Canada, they will implement the registry. And so we want data verification with that registry. We want enforcement mechanisms with that registry. We want tip line, and we want it to be publicly accessible, because as much as we'd like to say, let's have law enforcement only have access and do the investigations, let's be frank, a lot of investigations start because of whistleblowers or journalists or civil society raising the flag on something. So that's why we need it to be publicly accessible.
Do you I guess like the question becomes, you use the UK as an example, but there are other examples of places that are doing an exceptionally better job than us. I mean, the US might have a similar thing, not for beneficial ownership per se, but they have the IRS tip line for taxes, and you get people sort of, reporting one another for lack of tax reporting. And I think something similar exists in Canada. I believe it was brought in by the Harper administration. Is there anywhere else, any other places in the world that we should be looking for a good example of this?
Yeah, well, for one, the UK registry, I wouldn't even use it as an example to copy because they were the ones that went first. So they're more of the guinea pigs than the gold standard because there's a lot of issues with the UK registry. But more are coming online. So France's public beneficial ownership registry, it just became public. A number of other European countries are setting up their registries and getting them to become public. The US will have a registry, but it won't be public. But there's about close to 100 countries around the world who have pledged or already actively implementing a registry that will either be public or private. So the more countries that we have doing this, again, that's the less and less space the money launderers have to move. So for Canada, we have the ability to actually be ahead of the pack when we develop this registry, because right now the bar is kind of low on how the quality of them. Beyond that, there's a lot of talk about next steps about a Canadian financial crime agency to actually do the investigating and back this all up with enforcement. So there's a lot of speculation of what it could look like, and I wouldn't have a recommendation on it yet. I think what Public Safety Canada is doing right now, doing an assessment, is the right thing to do before coming up with a plan that they can't implement or that might not work. Because it's still a matter of, do we need a whole new agency, or do we have the infrastructure in our various law enforcement laws and we just actually need to use them properly? And that's oftentimes the case. We've got the laws, we just don't enforce them very well.
Fair enough. That's an excellent point. And I guess that would maybe bring me to sort of the last question here, which is, on the enforcement topic, it's kind of similar to the non-resident speculation taxes or the idea of a foreign ownership ban. It's like there is a degree of circumvention available to a lot of people. And, there was impacts like in Ontario, the non-resident speculation tax was applied to the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And then you just saw values of properties outside of the Greater Golden Horseshoe go up. So it almost created a even worse second order effect. I guess the question, they claim that the non-resident speculation tax reduced foreign ownership in real estate from 5% to 3%, which is meaningful if it's true. Are we seeing similar impacts or any positive impacts of beneficial ownership registries in these other countries who are doing their own iterations? And if so, like what kind of expectation would you have that if we executed it well, would be the impact that it could have here on decreasing money laundering in Canada?
Yeah, so data point we always look to is the idea of Scottish limited partnerships. In the early 2010s, the incorporation of SLPs were steadily going up through the decade, and it had been known that SLPs were often used by various mafia groups, Eastern European kleptocracy networks, because of the little oversight and the prestige that came with them. When the UK Registry of Persons of Significant Ownership or Control came out and made SLPs public knowledge, the incorporation rate of SLPs dropped 80%. So there is a deterrent effect. And again, those websites that we scan for our report, Snowwashing Inc., they blatantly say that. They say, has the UK become too transparent for you? It is right there written. So come to Canada. So they are looking for the credit. Exactly as you point out, if you put like the tax around the GTA or the Golden Horseshoe, fine, everyone just goes outside of it. And that's why we're saying you can't have a holdout province. And then on the decline of foreign ownership, this has been a problem I've had with, and it was even in the final report of the Cohen Commission, taking the Canadian Mortgage Housing Council's word for it, that there isn't a foreign ownership or money laundering problem because the numbers don't show that. Yeah, but we don't know that money launderers aren't kind of layering to the point where they have a Canadian corporation that then buys the property or a nominee, because we just don't have the data yet. So to say absolute flat out, we don't know, or that it's not there, you can't do that. You can say at best, we don't know, That's at least honest, because I also don't know the level of it, but I know that there is an issue.
So you can't really necessarily create a policy environment to solve this problem until we know what that problem is. And I think that, the beneficial ownership registry is the easiest way to find that out.
It'll definitely give you a better handle on it. I think, there are policies to it, but what you can't do is be in denial of the problem. Like, absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence kind of deal. Just because our way of measuring things doesn't show that there's a problem, we do know that there's a problem because of RCMP reports, because of intelligence, because of the amount of crackdowns is limited as they are there. We do know that we have a problem. We do know that other similar countries have a problem, and this is an actual global issue that's going on. So just to say by the barefaced numbers of what we are able to measure doesn't suffice.
Fair enough. Excellent points. I think that kind of concludes everything that I wanted to discuss. Is there any points that you wanted to add that I didn't necessarily cover that you feel are of great importance?
I think, just that point of the provinces need to come on board. I know a lot of people, the first trigger effect will be to dump on the federal government. And Lord knows we did over the last couple of years until they declared that there's going to be the beneficial ownership registry. I don't want to take them completely off the hook. There's still a lot to do. We still have to see what the registry looks like, but at least it's a step. So we really do need the provinces now to follow up. The federal government could have strong-armed them or maybe even taken other ways to circumvent the provinces, but we're going, the corporate registry route that everyone amends it. So they need to step up and do their job and not just say we take it seriously, but they actually need to do something.
Fair enough. Yeah, excellent point. Okay. And if people want to learn more about your organization or the work that you're doing, is there somewhere that they can follow you or check the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. Check out our website at www.transparencycanada.ca. You can follow us on Twitter at TI_Canada. You can follow myself at James Cohen 82. We're on LinkedIn and we're on Facebook as well.
Amazing. Okay. Thanks a lot, James. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care.